Have you ever met someone who wasn't at all what they seemed? A quiet mechanic in a snowy mountain town, a little girl with eyes too wise for her age, and a stranger, cold, tired, lost, who walked straight into their world and uncovered a secret buried beneath a tool bench. This is a story about a man who left behind a billion-dollar empire to raise his daughter in peace. A woman who had every reason to run and every reason to stay, and a key to a private jet, forgotten but not lost. But this isn't just a story about money or mystery. It's about healing, about choosing love after loss, and about finding your way home, even if you've forgotten where it is. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt stories about redemption, kindness, and second chances, stories that stay with you long after the last word, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It's free, and it helps us bring more beautiful stories like this one to life. Now, settle in. Take a deep breath, because this story might just stay with you too. Let's begin. A struggling single dad took in a hitchhiker. She found a private jet key under his tool bench. The first snow had come early that year. It fell in thick, quiet sheets across the mountains of western Montana, blurring the pine trees into shadows and cloaking the highway in a coat of treacherous white. Inside his garage, Tom Bennett wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag, listening to the storm beat against the roof like the ticking of an old clock, the kind of sound that reminded him how long winter could last. "How much longer, Daddy?" A voice came from the corner where a little girl, no more than 9, sat curled up in an oversized sweatshirt, her bare feet tucked beneath her on the folding chair. Her name was Lily, and she had her mother's eyes, gentle, wide, full of quiet questions. Tom glanced over his shoulder and smiled. 10 more minutes. Promise. Then we'll head in and make grilled cheese. Deal?" Lily nodded solemnly, clutching her worn book. The garage was cold, but she never complained. Tom turned back to the old Ford truck he was working on, twisting a socket wrench with practiced ease. He liked the silence of this place, the smell of oil, the steady rhythm of turning bolts. It was a different kind of peace, one that made the world quiet long enough for a man to think, which was exactly why he heard it. The crunch of footsteps on fresh snow. He straightened up slowly. Footsteps out here, this deep in the mountains, were rare, especially in weather like this. He wiped his hands and stepped out from under the hood, eyes narrowing toward the garage door, which was still half open to the wind. She appeared like a ghost from the storm. A woman, late 20s or early 30s, blonde hair tangled with flakes of snow, coat too thin. Eyes alert with the wild panic of someone who had clearly not planned for the cold. "Please," she called out, her voice ragged. I don't mean to intrude. My car skidded off the road a few miles back. Phone's dead. I've been walking for over an hour." Lily stood now too, her eyes wide with concern. Tom's instincts kicked in before his mind could catch up. He stepped forward, motioning her inside. "Get in here before you freeze. You're soaked through." The woman hesitated, then stumbled into the garage, visibly shaking. Tom grabbed a blanket from the shelf, wrapping it around her shoulders. Without a word, "Name's Tom. This is my daughter Lily." "Margaret," she replied, her lips barely moving. "Thank you. I wasn't sure I'd find anyone out here." "You're lucky you did," he said, not unkindly. "Storm's just getting started." He poured her a cup of lukewarm coffee from the thermos on the workbench. It wasn't much, but her grateful expression made it feel like gold. The cabin was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, built decades ago with more love than symmetry. But it was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine. Margaret sat near the fireplace, hands cupped around a mug of tea, as Lily changed into her pajamas in the next room. Tom busied himself in the kitchen, flipping grilled cheese sandwiches on the stovetop. He moved with a quiet efficiency, like someone used to doing everything alone. "You live way out here by yourself?" Margaret finally asked. Tom nodded. Just me and Lily. No neighbors, he shrugged. Closest one's about 3 miles down. Good folks, but we keep to ourselves mostly. Margaret sipped her tea. She studied him, tall, built like a man who worked with his hands, but with a calmness in his voice that didn't quite fit the usual small-town mechanic type. His eyes, a deep grey blue, seemed older than his face, like they'd seen more than their share. "You always been a mechanic?" she asked. Tom hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Then he nodded again. More or less, a lie, she sensed. Or maybe just a half-truth. Margaret was asleep in the guest room, really just a cot in Tom's office, but the blankets were warm and she was too tired to care. Lily had drifted off hours ago, curled up with her stuffed bear and the nightlight, humming softly by her bed. Tom sat alone by the fire, a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the silence had a different weight now. He looked toward the hallway, then stood and walked to the old tool bench in the garage. It was something he rarely touched anymore, not since he knelt down, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a small, unmarked metal box. Inside, buried beneath a few scraps of cloth, was a single object, a black and silver key engraved with the Falcon Jet logo, worn but unmistakable. He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the box, slowly, deliberately. Some things, he told himself, were better left buried. Morning came quietly, the kind of soft powder-blue dawn that only arrives after a heavy snow. The world outside Tom's cabin lay still, blanketed in white, as if the storm had never raged at all. But inside the house, things were still settling. Margaret, stirred on the cot in Tom's office, cocooned in layers of flannel blankets. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then came the slow recognition, the log walls, the faint smell of firewood, the aching cold that had finally left, her bones, and the man, Tom. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back. She had been on the road for days before the crash, hitching rides, avoiding cities, running from something she hadn't dared name yet. Her coat hung on a chair nearby, dry now. Someone, him, no doubt, had taken care to lay out clean socks, a mug of water, even a note in neat handwriting. "Breakfast is on the stove. Help yourself." She blinked at it. A stranger would have just let her sleep on a couch and be done with it. But Tom, there was a gentleness to the way he moved through the world, unassuming, but deliberate, like someone who had learned the value of softness after a lifetime of hardness. In the kitchen, she found Lily sitting at the table, legs swinging under her chair, buttering toast with all the focus of a tiny scientist. A plate of scrambled eggs sat between them, still warm. "Good morning," Margaret said gently. Lily looked up, her face bright. "Hi. Daddy said you could have the eggs. He went to help Mr. Delaney shovel snow." Margaret smiled. "That's kind of him." The girl shrugged. "He's always like that, helps everybody, even when he's tired." Margaret sat across from her, studying the child's face, so much like Tom's, and yet something else too. An openness, a stillness. "Do you like living here?" Margaret asked. Lily nodded, then paused. "It gets lonely sometimes." "But Daddy says lonely and peaceful are cousins." Margaret blinked. That was a sentence you didn't expect from a 9-year-old. "Your dad sounds very wise," Lily grinned. "He reads old books, like really old ones. And sometimes he talks to the stars when he thinks I'm sleeping." Margaret laughed softly. "Does he?" The girl nodded seriously, then leaned closer and whispered, "He thinks I don't hear, but I do. He tells Mommy everything." The smile fell from Margaret's lips. "Your mum? She died when I was 6. Daddy doesn't talk about it, and much, but he sings sometimes. That's when I know he misses her." Margaret didn't answer right away. She just reached across the table and squeezed Lily's hand. "I'm sorry," she said. Lily gave a soft, grown-up shrug. "It's okay. Daddy says love doesn't leave, it just changes its clothes. Later that day, while Lily napped in a sun-warmed patch of carpet, Margaret wandered into the garage again. Curiosity tugged at her like wind through an open door. She wasn't nosy, not really, but something about Tom's quiet, thoughtful eyes told her he had stories buried deep. The place was orderly in a rugged way. Wrenches hung neatly, a half-dismantled snowmobile sat in the corner, and a wood stove ticked softly in the background. Her eyes drifted toward the old tool bench. Something about it caught her attention, an age-worn surface, burnished from years of use, but too pristine to be just an old table. There was care in every nick, every stain, a story written in wood grain. Out of habit, she opened the middle drawer. Nothing unusual, screws, bolts, a frayed measuring tape. Then the bottom one, slightly stuck. Inside, she saw what looked like an old cigar box, heavy. When she lifted the lid, her breath caught a key, sleek, silver and black, engraved with the name Falcon Jet. The logo was unmistakable. She'd grown up around that world. Her father had business partners who flew private, talked in quiet tones over whiskey and contracts. She remembered the logo from glossy magazines and cocktail parties where no one made eye contact with the waitstaff. What was a Falcon Jet key doing in the workbench of a mountain mechanic? A chill ran through her, and not from the snow. She closed the box quickly, almost ashamed she'd looked, but the question stuck in her mind like a thorn. Who are you really, Tom Bennett? He returned late in the afternoon, snow-dusted and flushed from the cold. She watched him carefully as he shrugged off his coat and kissed Lily's forehead, then turned to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better, warm, and full, thanks to Lily's cooking tips." Tom chuckled. "She does think she's a chef these days." Margaret hesitated, then said, "You're kind. You didn't have to take me in, especially not in the middle of a snowstorm." He shrugged. "Didn't seem right to leave you out there." "Still," she added, meeting his gaze, "I'm not used to people like you." He tilted his head. "Like me. Kind, quiet, steady. Most people I've met are running from something, or toward something." Tom's face darkened, just a flicker. Then he nodded. "Maybe I'm both." She smiled faintly. "That's honest." For a moment, the silence between them stretched. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, like snow falling in a forest, gentle but impossible to ignore. That night, Margaret lay awake on the cot, staring at the wooden beams above her. She thought about the key, about Lily's words, about the way Tom had looked at her when she said the word running. Something was buried here, under layers of kindness and repair. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she had the strangest feeling that she hadn't just stumbled into a cabin. She'd stumbled into a story, one that wasn't finished, and somehow she was now part of it. 2 days had passed since Margaret stumbled through the snow and into Tom's world. 2 days of warmth, quiet meals, and evenings by the fire where no one pressed too hard for answers. But curiosity, like snowmelt, had a way of seeping into everything. Tom hadn't asked a single question about where she came from or what she was running from. That made Margaret trust him more, and also made her want to know his story, because no one lives that simply unless they're hiding something. That afternoon, while Tom took Lily sledding on the slope behind the cabin, Margaret returned to the garage. She didn't mean to snoop, at least not in the way people usually mean when they say that, but something about that Falcon Jet key hadn't let go of her thoughts. Not just because it was expensive, not just because it was strange, because it didn't belong here. She approached the tool bench with a cautious step, like someone walking into an old church. Reverent, careful. The box was still where she'd left it. She opened it again, slowly. This time, as if she half expected an alarm to go off, there it was, sleek and heavy in her palm, with a subtle glint of engraved steel. She ran her thumb along the edge of the key, Falcon Jet, the brand known for building luxury aircraft for the world's elite, private terminals, seven-figure price tags, custom leather interiors. It was the kind of thing her father had once sneered about over drinks. Those Silicon Valley boys and their toys, he used to say. More money than sense. So what was this key doing here, in a garage where the most valuable thing was probably the snowmobile engine rusting in the corner? Margaret pulled her phone from her coat pocket, tapping the Falcon Jet name into a search bar. With a little digging and a few guesswork serial numbers from the side of the key fob, she found what she wasn't ready for. Tail number, N637FJ. Model, Falcon 2000S. Owner, prior registration, Thomas Bennett. She stared at the screen, her mouth dry. Tom Bennett owned or had owned a $30 million aircraft. She blinked at the screen again. Her stomach twisted. Maybe it was a mistake, a coincidence, but deep down she already knew it wasn't. The man who had patched her jeans, grilled her toast, and read bedtime stories to his daughter by firelight was not just a good-hearted mountain mechanic. He was, or had been, someone very different. When Tom and Lily returned, snow-dusted and laughing, Margaret watched him carefully. She tried to see him differently, but she couldn't. He still moved like Tom, still wiped Lily's nose with a napkin tucked in his coat pocket, still smiled with that quiet, inward kind of peace. Later, while Lily built a snow fort outside the window, Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter, mug in hand. "You ever fly?" she asked casually. Tom's head turned slowly. "Fly? Planes? Jets?" He paused. "Not in a long time." That answer was too precise. Not no, but not in a long time. She nodded, sipping her tea like the conversation meant nothing. "Funny, my dad used to do business with people in the private aviation world. A Falcon Jet key was like a secret handshake." She glanced sideways at him. Tom said nothing. He leaned back against the counter, his hands gripping the edge. His eyes were far away now, pointed somewhere past the pine trees outside. Margaret didn't press. She just let the silence breathe between them. Finally, he said, "I haven't touched that thing in years." There it was. Confession. Quiet. And unfinished. "You don't seem like the kind of man who lives in the clouds," she said softly. "I don't anymore," Tom replied, voice flat. That night, she couldn't sleep. Too many things didn't add up. Not just the key. The piano in the corner of the living room, an antique Steinway, well-tuned, the books lining the shelves, first editions, a mix of engineering texts and literary classics. The way he spoke to Lily, like someone who had read volumes about parenting, but lived it from the heart. Margaret sat by the fireplace long after the house had gone quiet. The flames flickered like memories on the wall. She pulled out her journal, something she hadn't opened in months. She used to write every day, when she was younger, when she still believed she had control over her story. Tonight, she wrote one line. There is something noble in him, and something broken too. The next morning, Tom stood by the back porch, sipping coffee from his dented thermos as the sun melted the edges of snow off the pine branches. Margaret joined him, arms folded tight against the cold. "Nice view," she said. "Best one for miles?" She hesitated, then said it. "I found the key." Tom didn't flinch. "I looked it up," she continued. "I know you owned that jet." A long silence. A winter kind of silence. Then he nodded, slow and heavy, as if the weight of the truth had finally caught up. "I did," he said. She waited. "I used to be someone else," he added. "And now?" He turned to her, his eyes steady. "Now I'm just a dad." The next morning brought a calm so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. Outside, the snow had settled like a thick quilt across the hills. Smoke curled from the chimney as Margaret sat at the small kitchen table, watching Lily. "Draw pictures in a spiral-bound notebook." "What's that one?" Margaret asked, leaning over the table. Lily looked up and smiled. "It's our house, and that's Daddy." That's me. And that's you. Margaret blinked. Me? Uh-huh, Lily said matter-of-factly. You're the one by the tree, with a book. You look happy. Margaret studied the child's version of her. Bright yellow hair, a red scarf, a wide smile. She hadn't thought of herself that way in a long time. Do you draw often? She asked. Only when I feel something. What do you feel now? Lily shrugged. Safe. Margaret's throat tightened unexpectedly. Later that morning, while Tom repaired a busted pipe in the back shed, Margaret found herself alone with Lily again, this time curled up on the worn couch with a blanket over their legs and a cup of cocoa between them. The fire crackled nearby, casting soft light over the room. Can I ask you something? Lily asked, her voice small. Of course. Are you going to leave? Margaret hesitated. Why do you ask? Because people always do, Lily said without sadness, just certainty. Daddy says it's just part of life. But I don't think he really believes that. Margaret looked into the girl's eyes, so open, so earnest. She wasn't sure how to answer. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I like being here. With you, with your dad. It feels different. Better. Different or scary, different. Better, Margaret said softly. Much better. Lily nodded like she understood something far older than her years. Then, without warning, she leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. They sat like that for a long time. No words needed, just the warmth of trust, filling the spaces that had been cold for too long. Later that day, while cleaning the bookshelves, Margaret came across a photo tucked behind a stack of novels. It was slightly faded, the edges curling. A woman, mid-30s, chestnut hair pulled back in a soft bun, eyes bright with life, stood smiling next to Tom, who looked 10 years younger but already wore the same quiet gravity he carried now. Between them, a toddler sat on Tom's shoulders, giggling. The little girl's expression was unmistakable. Lily. It was the first time Margaret saw the missing piece of this home, and now she could feel it, in the spaces they never spoke about, the kind of love that leaves shadows. Tom entered the room, just as she was sliding the photo back. She was beautiful, Margaret said gently. Tom paused, the air shifting. She was, he said, stepping beside her. Her name was Elise. She was everything this house ever needed. How long has it been? 3 years. Cancer. The kind that doesn't ask questions first. Margaret nodded, keeping her eyes on the fireplace. Lily talks about her. She remembers. She was 6 when Elise passed. She remembers more than I thought she would. Sometimes I think she carries more than she should. Tom took a breath. I tried to do it right, you know, step away from all the noise, the money, the headlines. I didn't want Lily growing up in a world where every smile had a price tag. You gave up everything, Margaret said. Tom nodded. Some days, it still feels like not enough. That evening, Lily insisted on reading bedtime stories to Margaret instead of the other way around. She pulled out a tattered copy of The Velveteen Rabbit and curled up at the end of the couch, reading in soft, deliberate tones. When she finished, she looked up and said, "You know what's my favorite part?" "What's that?" Margaret asked. "When the rabbit asks what it means to be real, and the skin horse says, it doesn't happen all at once. You become. It takes a long time." Margaret smiled. "That's my favorite part, too." "Do you think I'm real yet?" Lily asked, only half joking. Margaret laughed, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind the girl's ear. "I think you're the realest person I've ever met." And in that moment, she wasn't sure who was healing who. Later, after Lily had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, Tom joined Margaret by the fire. He handed her a cup of tea without a word and sat down across from her. "You're good with her," he said after a moment. "She's easy to love." Tom nodded slowly. "She's resilient, stronger than I ever was at that age." "You gave her a safe place to grow. That's more than most kids get." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "You have a way of softening things." What things? The corners, the silence, the weight. Margaret felt something shift inside. Something tender and unfamiliar. "You've built something good here, Tom," she said. "Even if it's different than what you thought your life would be." He studied her for a moment, then said, "Sometimes I wonder if I've just been hiding." "And sometimes," she replied, "hiding is what keeps us alive long enough to come back out." They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things, grief, hope, maybe something beginning. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently past the window like memories falling back to earth. And inside, a little family, formed by chance, mended by kindness, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming something real. The snow had begun to melt by the end of the week. Not quickly, not enough to turn the dirt road to mud, but just enough to make the trees weep icicles and the roof drip in steady rhythm. Inside the cabin, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee, and the world felt softer somehow, less like winter, more like waiting. Tom had planned to spend the day fixing the engine on old Mr. Delaney's snowplow down the road, and Margaret offered to tag along, curious to see the part of the world Tom never talked about but quietly maintained. Lily was at the neighbor's house across the way, baking cookies and bossing around their golden retriever with the authority of a queen. That left Tom and Margaret riding side by side in his truck down the snow-dusted back roads of the valley. "Ever get tired of all this quiet?" she asked as they drove. Tom glanced over at her. "Not once." She smiled. "You're a rare breed, Tom Bennett." He didn't answer, but his eyes crinkled just slightly at the corners. Mr. Delaney's place sat on a wide stretch of land tucked beneath the hills, the kind of property that had been in the same family for generations. A leaning barn stood guard behind the house, and a rusted windmill creaked in the wind like it had a secret it would never tell. Delaney was already outside when they arrived, bundled in a jacket 2 sizes too big and a scarf that looked older. "Then the hills. Tom Bennett," he called out, his voice gravel and warmth. "I figured I'd see you sooner or later. Snowplow finally gave out. Again." Tom climbed out of the truck and shook the man's hand. "You treat that plow worse than your tractor," he said with a smirk. "I treat everything equally bad," Delaney said with a wink. Margaret stood to the side, watching them with quiet interest. There was something easy about their exchange, the kind of banter that only came with years of quiet help and few words. Tom got to work immediately, lifting the hood and disappearing into the tangle of old wires and frost-bitten bolts. Delaney turned to Margaret and smiled. "You the guest?" "I guess I am," she said. "I'm Margaret." "Well, you're braver than most. Not many folks come out here voluntarily." Margaret smiled, folding her arms. "Let's say I didn't exactly plan it." "Ah," Delaney nodded knowingly. "Life's better when it doesn't go according to plan. Just look at that boy there." She glanced at Tom, who was elbow-deep in machinery. "He's quiet," she said. Delaney chuckled. "Always has been, except when he was someone else." Margaret turned to him slowly. "Someone else?" The old man squinted toward the horizon. "You didn't hear it from me, of course. Not that I know much. Just enough to keep a little respect in my bones." She waited, heart nudging against her ribs. "I don't know exactly where he came from. Just that he bought this place with cash, no fuss, no explanation. Showed up with a little girl, a box of tools, and eyes that didn't blink much. People in town used to whisper. Some still do. Said he was someone big. Before." Margaret's breath caught. "Before what?" "Before he broke," Delaney said simply. She stared at the old man, unsure what to say. "He won't tell you," Delaney added, "but if you stick around long enough, you'll see it." "Not in what he says, but what he doesn't." Margaret turned her gaze back to Tom. He was working quietly, his hands steady, movements sure. But there was a loneliness to him that seemed carved into the curve of his back. as if he carried more than he let on, tucked beneath each quiet breath. On the ride back, Margaret sat quietly, letting the silence stretch like thread between them. "You always fix everyone's machines?" she finally asked. Tom shrugged. "If I can. You ever charge them?" "Not always." "Why not?" He smiled without looking at her. "Because I know what it feels like to have something break that you can't afford to fix." She stared out the window, snowbanks rolling past. "Mr. Delaney told me a little about when you came here," she said gently. "Said people think you used to be someone else." Tom didn't answer at first. He just kept driving. After a long pause, he said, "I was." Margaret waited, but nothing more came. He offered no details, no confessions, just those 3 words, "I was." That evening, Tom stood by the kitchen sink washing dishes while Margaret sat nearby, drying them one by one. The window behind him framed a sky painted in pale oranges and soft pinks. "Do you miss it?" she asked, softly. "Miss what? Who you were?" Tom didn't answer right away. "I miss some things," he said at last. "Flying, building things, knowing what my next 5 years looked like. But most of what I left behind—" He paused. "No, I don't miss that." Margaret dried another plate. "Sometimes I think people hide not because they're afraid, but because they're tired." Tom glanced at her. "Maybe it's both." They stood there for a while, the light fading behind them, the house growing quieter with every passing moment. In the next room, Lily played a soft tune on the piano, a lullaby neither of them recognized, but both felt in their bones. As the last note faded into silence, Margaret looked at Tom. "You know," she said, "when I first got here I thought you were just a good man trying to make ends meet in the middle of nowhere." He smiled faintly. "And now?" "Now I think you're a man trying very hard not to be found." Tom didn't smile this time. He just met her eyes and said, "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure out if being found is worth the risk." And neither of them said another word for the rest of the night. Margaret hadn't meant to dig. She'd promised herself that. After all, Tom had offered her nothing but kindness, a roof, warmth, safety. And not once had he asked where she'd come from or what she was running from. But there was a difference between prying and trying to understand. And after what Delaney said, before he broke, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Tom's story wasn't just complicated. It was important. So that night, long after Lily had gone to bed, and Tom retreated to the garage to tinker with something he claimed was almost interesting, Margaret sat down with her laptop and did the one thing she swore she wouldn't. She searched his name. It was innocent at first. Just Tom Bennett, Montana. But she came up with nothing. Too many Bennetts, too many empty trails. Then she remembered the jet key. Falcon jet. The tail number she had seen engraved on the side, N637FJ. She typed it in. The screen flickered, and then registration, Falcon 2000S, owner of record, archived, Thomas J. Bennett. Her breath caught. She followed the link further, tracing archived aviation records, cross-referenced articles, corporate filings. And there, suddenly, like a door swinging open in her chest, was the man she knew staring back at her from a world she didn't recognize. Thomas Bennett, founder and former CEO of Velocity Aerotech, disappeared from public view after the tragic death of his wife, Elise Hammond Bennett, in a company test flight gone wrong. Bennett had built his company from a garage startup to one of the leading players in next-gen aviation software. His departure sent shockwaves through the tech and investment world. He was last seen publicly in Denver 3 years ago. The article included a photo. He looked younger, cleaner shaven, but it was him. The same eyes, the same quiet intensity. Margaret sat frozen. A dozen feelings crashed against each other. Disbelief, awe, confusion, and a flicker of something like betrayal. He had disappeared, chosen to vanish, and somehow she'd stumbled into the life he'd built from the wreckage, When Tom returned to the house, brushing snow from his sleeves, she didn't say anything. Not right away. He looked tired. Not in the way a man is tired from labor, but from memory. They moved through their usual motions. Tea, firewood, quiet conversation, but Margaret was no longer simply in the moment. She was watching it, watching him, watching what it meant for someone to walk away from an empire and become a man who knelt to tie his daughter's boots and baked muffins from boxed mix. It wasn't the money that unsettled her. It was the pain that had to come before he left it behind. The next morning, while Lily played outside making snow angels, Margaret joined Tom at the woodpile, helping stack firewood into a steel bin. The air was crisp and bright, but the conversation was not. "I know," she said quietly. Tom paused, mid-motion. "Know what? Who you are, who you were." He straightened slowly, brushing snow off his gloves. "How?" "Falcon Jet. Tail number. Your name's still buried in the records, even if you tried to erase it." Tom's jaw tightened. "He didn't speak. Velocity Aerotech," she added. "That was you." Tom stared at the tree line for a long moment. Then he dropped the last piece of wood into the bin and said, "I figured you'd find it eventually. That's all you're going to say?" "What do you want me to say?" She stepped closer, the cold forgotten between them. "I want to understand why you never told me. Because people change when they know," he said, voice low. "They treat you different. They expect things. Admiration, anger, a comeback story, something. And you didn't want that?" "I didn't want anything except to be a father. A decent one. Away from the noise. Away from headlines that said my wife died because I pushed too fast. Because I didn't run enough simulations. Because I was too proud to listen to the engineers who told me to wait." His voice broke slightly. "Just once. Enough." Margaret's chest ached. "Tom, I lost her because I believed my dreams were more important than caution, so I buried everything. The company, the money, the man I used to be. I sold the house, walked away from the jet, and drove until the world stopped recognizing me." He looked up at her now, eyes raw. "And then you showed up." They stood there in silence, the wind pushing against them gently, like it wasn't sure it should interrupt. Later that day, as Lily colored at the table, Margaret sat alone by the fire, flipping the pages of a book she wasn't reading. Her mind was spinning. He hadn't lied, not directly, but he'd omitted a truth so large it hung in the room like fog. And yet she couldn't blame him. She too had come here with pieces of herself she hadn't shared. Broken pieces, scattered ones. Maybe that's why she had recognized the ache in him before she knew his name. Maybe that's why she wasn't afraid of it. That evening she approached him again. This time not with questions, but something else. "Ah, you still him?" she asked. Tom looked at her confused. "Who?" "The man from the articles. The one who built the company, the one who ran from it all." He took a long breath. "Parts of him, maybe, but he doesn't fit in this life anymore." "Maybe," she said gently. "Or maybe he's just learning to wear a different skin." He looked away. "I'm not here to ask for answers," she added. "I'm here because I feel safe, and because I think Lily needs someone who sees you the way she does." Tom studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in days, he smiled. Truly smiled. "You don't want to leave, do you?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she whispered, "but I know I don't want to lie to myself anymore, and I don't want you to either." Outside, the stars returned, bright, clear, unapologetically distant. Inside, two people sat by a fire. Neither of them started alone, surrounded by truths they had run from for too long. And for the first time since Elise died, Tom didn't feel like a man hiding in the mountains. He felt like a man slowly walking home. The snow returned that night. Not the kind that drifted gently like lace, but a sharp, slicing wind that screamed down from the mountains. By morning, the world outside was white again, the trees glazed in ice and the windows rimmed with frost. Inside, the cabin, the fire still burned, but the air was heavy. Margaret hadn't slept, neither had Tom. They moved around each other like ghosts, careful not to touch the silence between them. Lily, blessedly oblivious, was in her own world, playing with paper dolls and humming to herself as the wind howled. Tom stood by the woodpile again, chopping kindling with a mechanical rhythm. His shoulders moved in a way that suggested tension rather than effort. Margaret watched him from the porch, coffee in hand, breath fogging in the cold. She didn't want to push, but she also couldn't pretend. She walked down the steps and stood in the snow, boots sinking into the crusted top. "Leia, we need to talk," she said. Tom paused, the axe frozen mid-air. Then he drove it down with a clean, angry crack and set the handle against the block. "I figured this was coming," he said quietly. Margaret folded her arms. "You let me believe you were just some small-town mechanic. I am a mechanic. You're also a man who used to be on the cover of Forbes." "That man's dead," she flinched. "Then who are you now?" He turned, finally facing her. "I'm a father. That's all I want to be. I don't want the headlines. I don't want the legacy. I sure as hell don't want to build another company that people blame when something breaks." Margaret stepped closer. "But you're still running." He stared at her, eyes narrowed. "I'm not judging you, Tom," she said. "I'm not. I just can't understand how someone like you can bury everything he was and live like none of it happened." His voice was low. "Because I had to." She shook her head. "No, you chose to, and maybe that was the right choice for a while, but at some point you stopped surviving and started hiding." Tom's jaw clenched. The snow whirled around them, biting and loud. "You don't know what it's like," he said finally. "To wake up and realize the thing you built, the thing you loved, is what killed the person you loved more." Margaret didn't move. Her voice softened. "Maybe I don't, but I know what it's like to run. And I know what it's like to look in the mirror and not recognize the version of yourself that survived." That stopped him. The storm eased just enough for her words to settle between them. Margaret went on, her voice breaking. "I left everything behind too, Tom. My family, my city, my name in a way, not because I had to, but because I couldn't live with who I had become." She swallowed. "You're not the only one carrying ghosts." Tom looked down at his boots, at the packed snow beneath them. "I never wanted Lily to grow up in a world where people only cared about her last name," he said. "I wanted her to know what real meant, not headlines, not private jets, just decency, stillness, something honest." "And she has that," Margaret said, stepping closer. "She has that because of you. But she's going to grow up one day and wonder why her father was afraid of being more." Tom blinked. "You think I'm afraid? I think you're terrified." A gust of wind blew between them. Tom turned toward the mountains, jaw tight. "You think I don't miss it?" he said, voice rough. "You think I don't dream about the work I left behind, the people I let down? I do, every day, but the only thing I couldn't afford to lose again was Lily." Margaret let the silence breathe. "I'm not asking you to go back to that life," she said gently. "I'm asking you to stop lying to yourself about who you are. You gave up everything, but that doesn't mean you stopped mattering." Tom's shoulders sagged. Then, quietly like a whisper, he said, "I don't know how to be both." She stepped closer, looking up into his eyes. "Maybe you don't have to be. Maybe you just have to be someone true, and not just for Lily. For you." Back inside, Lily looked up from her drawings as they stepped through the door. She studied their faces like only children do, reading things adults try so hard to hide. "Did you fight?" she asked. Margaret smiled softly. "We talked." "Did you cry?" Tom glanced at Margaret, who simply nodded. "A little," she said. Lily nodded too. That's good. Daddy always says people who don't cry get stuck. Tom blinked, caught off guard. I say that. Lily grinned. You did once. When I wouldn't let go of Bunny after the dryer shrunk him. Margaret laughed. The sound felt like light through a window. Tom stared at both of them, his daughter, this woman who somehow saw past the ruins and into the bones of who he still was. And for the first time, he allowed the possibility of more. Not a return, but a rebuilding. That night, after Lily fell asleep to the sound of wind in the chimney, Tom sat on the porch with Margaret, a blanket across their laps, a silence between them no longer thick with a fear. I was afraid, he said quietly. You were right. Margaret didn't say, I told you so. She just reached for his hand. I still am, he added. We all are, she whispered. But for the first time, he said, it doesn't feel like it has to last forever. And from the stillness, something began to thaw, not the snow, but the past. The snow had softened by morning, the kind that glistened instead of biting, that coated every branch and fence post in gentle white lace. It was the kind of winter day that made silence feel sacred. Tom stood by the window, sipping his coffee, eyes tracing the line of pines that framed the back hills. Margaret was still asleep, curled on the couch under the thick wool blanket he kept for the coldest nights. Lily sat at the table, drawing as usual. Today, two people holding hands under a tree that looked suspiciously like the one outside the kitchen. Daddy? She asked without looking up. Yeah, sweetheart? Can you take Miss Margaret to the hill today? Tom frowned slightly. What hill? She looked up. The one. Her hill. He went still. Then he smiled softly, almost painfully. We'll see. Lily returned to her sketching, but the words had already reached something deep inside him. That afternoon, with a picnic basket packed and Lily left under the neighbor's watchful eye, Tom turned to Margaret. There's a place I want to show. You, he said, if you're up for a walk. The hike wasn't long, but the snow made it slow going. The trail twisted upward through a patch of evergreens and flattened out into a clearing that opened like a breath held too long. Margaret's step slowed as she took in the view, a wide, sweeping ridge that overlooked the valley below. The sun, hanging low behind clouds that glowed pale gold. At the edge of the clearing stood a single wooden bench, weathered, quiet. She picked this spot, Tom said softly. Elise, he nodded, said it was where the sky came closest to Earth. She used to come up here when the chemo got too hard, said it made her feel like she wasn't sick anymore. Margaret didn't speak. She followed him to the bench and sat beside him, her hands folded still. We bought this land long before the company got big. It was supposed to be our escape from the noise. Back then, I still thought I could have both, ambition and peace. He smiled without humor. Turns out, I wasn't very good at balancing. Margaret looked at him, her voice low. She was the one who kept you grounded. Tom's eyes stayed on the sky. She was everything. The morning after she died, I came. Up here, Lily was still asleep. I sat on this bench and promised her I'd raise our daughter right. Without headlines, without boardrooms, without the machine chewing her up. He paused. So I disappeared, sold everything, bought this place outright, packed a duffel bag, and Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit and drove until the noise stopped. Margaret felt her chest tighten. You don't regret it? She asked. Tom exhaled. Not for a second, but sometimes... He looked at her now. Sometimes I wonder if I stopped living when she did. Margaret placed her gloved hand gently over his. I don't think you stopped living, she said. I think you paused. Tom let her words settle like snow on branches. They sat in silence for a while, sharing the stillness Elise had once loved. A hawk circled in the distance, silent wings cutting across the pale sky. You're the first person I've brought up here, he said after a while. Margaret blinked. Really? Not even Delaney, not my sister when she visited once, just you. She looked at him, then at the view, and whispered, "Thank you." Tom's gaze stayed on the mountains. "I didn't know how much I needed to come back here until Lily said it this morning. She remembers, not the sickness, but the place. Elise made sure of that." Margaret smiled. "Your daughter's remarkable." "She is," he said. "She got Elise's heart. My worry." "She's lucky," Margaret replied. "To have had Elise, and to have you now." Tom turned to her slowly. "I don't know what I'm doing most days. I try. But sometimes I worry I'm raising her in a bubble, that I've built this life so carefully to avoid pain that I might be keeping joy out too." Margaret's voice was soft. "That's the thing about love. You can't close the door on pain without closing it on joy too." He nodded. "You've been through it too, haven't you?" She looked down at her gloves. "In a different way. Mine wasn't loss. It was disillusionment, realizing the people who were supposed to love me only knew how to control, and realizing I'd spent years pretending I was okay with it." Tom studied her, quiet admiration behind his eyes. "You're not pretending anymore," he said. "No," she whispered, "not here." As the sun dipped lower, they packed up and began the walk back, their steps falling into a rhythm neither had to think about. Side by side, no longer strangers orbiting each other's wounds, but companions, perhaps, on the road towards something new. At the cabin, Lily ran to greet them with chocolate on her face, and news of a snowman as tall as a grizzly. Tom scooped her up, spinning her once, laughter filling the air. Margaret stood back for a moment, watching the two of them, father and daughter, light returning to their faces like dawn after a long, dark night. That evening, Tom pulled out a dusty photo album and placed it on the table. "I think it's time she knows more about her mom," he said, opening the first page. Lily climbed onto his lap, and Margaret sat beside them. They spent the night flipping pages, telling stories, filling in blanks with laughter and tears. Margaret learned Elise's favorite pie was lemon meringue, that she couldn't whistle, loved sad French films, and once sang off-key at their wedding just to make Tom laugh. And somewhere between the photos and the firelight, Margaret understood something. This wasn't a house with a missing piece. It was a house with room for one more. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not because the house lacked noise, but because the noise inside had settled. Tom smiled more. Lily laughed louder. Even the fire seemed to burn with steadier warmth. The cabin, once just a refuge from a storm, now felt like something more, like a home built not just from wood and stone, but from second chances. And for Margaret, it had become the first place in years where her guard had come down without her permission. She'd stopped checking her phone. She'd stopped looking over her shoulder. She'd started to wonder what staying might look like. But the past has a peculiar way of finding you, especially when it isn't finished. It came in the form of a voicemail. Margaret had been folding laundry when she remembered her phone, dead and untouched in her coat pocket for days. She plugged it in, not expecting much, but as the screen blinked to life, a red icon stared back at her. 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the play button. She didn't want to hear it. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here, not in this new quiet world, but she pressed play anyway. "Margaret, it's Carol. Listen, I know you didn't want to be found, but your mother had a stroke. It's not good. She's in ICU at Mercy General. She's asking for you. Please, just come home. If not for her, then for yourself." The message ended in static. Margaret stood frozen, laundry half-folded, the room suddenly tilting in quiet betrayal. Her mother, after all these years, after the fights, the distance, the silence. Now she was asking for her. Why now? She didn't tell Tom right away. She went for a walk first, alone, boots crunching in fresh snow, scarf pulled up to her chin. The air was sharp, clean, but her mind was clouded. She'd spent years building a life around not needing her family, around not needing anyone. But in a single, breathless message, she'd been pulled back into a story she thought she'd burned. Years ago, by the time she returned to the cabin, the sun was starting to fade. Tom was sitting at the table, Lily next to him, both of them working on a puzzle that looked about 20 pieces too complicated for either of them. "You okay?" he asked gently. She tried to smile. "Failed. I need to talk to you," she said. Tom stood. So did something inside him. They sat across from each other in the quiet living room, fire casting low shadows on the walls. "I got a message," she began, "from my sister." Tom said nothing, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "My mom had a stroke. She's in the hospital in LA. Still, he didn't speak, he just waited. She's asking for me, which is surprising." Tom leaned forward. "Are you going?" Margaret exhaled. "I don't know." Silence. Tom nodded slowly. "You should. If it's something you need to face, then go. You'll never forgive yourself if you don't." Margaret looked at him, startled. "That's not what I expected you to say." He smiled, tired. "I've run away from enough to know what happens when you don't go back." She reached for his hand. "I don't want to leave this." "You're not," he said gently. "You're just stepping out of it. That's different." That night, Lily came into Margaret's room, dragging her stuffed bunny behind her. "Daddy says you have to go somewhere," she said. Margaret nodded, pulling the covers back for her. "Just for a little while." Lily climbed in beside her. "Are you coming back?" "I want to," Margaret whispered. "Very much." "Then you will," Lily said simply, "because people always come back to what feels like home." Margaret couldn't speak. She just held the child tightly, wondering when she had become someone worth missing. The next morning, Tom helped load her bag into the truck. The sun had barely risen, but the sky was pink with promise. The air was sharp and full of the kind of silence that says goodbye without speaking. "I can drive myself to town," she said. "I know," Tom replied, "but I want to take you." They didn't talk much on the ride. At the edge of the town where the bus would take her to the airport, Tom pulled over. He turned toward her, his voice low. "You don't owe me anything. Not even a promise." Margaret shook her head. "But I want to make one." Tom waited. "I'm not running. I'm not disappearing. I'm just finishing something that should have been finished years ago, and when it is, if there's still a place for me here, there will be," Tom said before she could finish. A pause. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed her something. It was the key, the Falcon Jet key. She stared at it. "I don't need it anymore," he said. Margaret looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "You sure?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe it'll help you get back." She boarded the bus 20 minutes later. Tom stood outside as it pulled away, hands in his pockets, snow swirling around his boots. He watched until the bus was gone, until the road was empty again. And though the wind bit at his coat and the cold pressed against his skin, he stayed there for a long time, because sometimes when you finally opened your heart to someone, the hardest thing isn't letting them in, it's letting them go, and trusting they'll come back. The first snowmelt came early that year. Tiny rivers of water began carving through the drifts outside Tom's cabin, running in soft trickles beneath the eaves. The air carried hints of pine sap and thawing earth. The firewood stack was lower now, and Lily had taken to counting birds outside the window, announcing each new arrival like a parade of spring. But something else had changed too, something quieter. Tom moved slower these days, not physically but emotionally, like a man who'd been holding his breath for weeks without realizing it. Every morning he looked at the road, and every night he told himself he wasn't waiting. But the truth settled in his bones like the snow on the roof. He missed her. It had been 18 days, 18 breakfasts without her leaning against the counter, sipping tea. 18 puzzles with Lily, none of which felt quite as fun. 18 times walking past the folded blanket on the couch and wondering if it still smelled like her. He'd thought he was done hoping for anything. But then she'd come in from the storm, like a story that refused to end in sorrow, and for a brief, impossible stretch of days, he believed again. Then the call came, and she left. He'd told her to go, and he meant it. But part of him wondered if maybe he'd just taught himself to let go too well. On the 19th day, it snowed again. Late, lazy flakes floated down from a grey sky, covering the thaw like a secret. Lily had gone across the road to bake cookies with the neighbours again, her absence filling the cabin with a kind of hush Tom didn't know what to do with. He sat on the porch steps, coat zipped, coffee growing cold in his hand, listening to the wind move through the trees like an old hymn. Then he heard it, not the wind, not the creek, not even birds. A car, tires crunching over gravel, slow, familiar. He stood, heart stuttering. The truck pulled into view, his truck, the one Margaret had driven into town nearly 3 weeks earlier. She stepped out slowly, no dramatic gestures, no suitcase, just a satchel slung over one shoulder and a look on her face he hadn't seen before, calm, certain, home. "Hey," she said. Tom swallowed hard. "Hey," Margaret looked around. "Looks like I brought the snow back." "I don't mind it," he said. They stood there for a moment, unsure how to close the distance, until Margaret did the simplest thing in the world. She walked forward and wrapped her arms around him. Tom didn't hesitate. He held her close, chin resting gently on her hair, breathing in a scent he hadn't realized he missed until now. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret smiled. "You left the Falcon jet. Key in the glove box." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Didn't need it. I found my way back without it," she said. Later, inside, they sat by the fire with mugs of tea. Lily had returned by then, and upon seeing Margaret, launched into her arms as if she'd only been gone a few hours. No guilt, no awkwardness, just joy, the pure, unfiltered kind that children give freely when they love someone. Once Lily was asleep, Margaret told him everything. The hospital, the sterile halls, the conversations she'd never thought she'd have. "She didn't change," Margaret said softly. "Not really. She's still sharp, still critical. But when she saw me, there was fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for what she'd lost. She said sorry. Once." Tom listened, hand resting on hers. "It wasn't the kind of apology that fixes anything," Margaret continued, "but it was enough to let me let go of all of it." She turned to him. "That version of me, the one that needed to run, she's gone now." Tom nodded, eyes shining. "And the version standing."
"Here."
Margaret smiled. "She's choosing to stay, not because she has to, but because she wants to." The next morning, Margaret stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while Lily set the table. Tom watched from the doorway, arms crossed. The scene. So normal it nearly undid him. "I thought we could go for a walk later," Margaret said over her shoulder. "Up to the ridge, if it's not too icy." Tom stepped in, brushed a hand along her back. "I'd like that." She turned to him, eyes full of quiet certainty. "There's more I want to build here, Tom. Not just memories. A life. Something that feels real." He reached for her hand and pressed a kiss into her knuckles. "You already are," he whispered. That afternoon they hiked back to Elise's hill. The snow was softer now, yielding underfoot. At the top, Tom stood for a moment, letting the wind pass over him. Then he turned to Margaret. "I used to come here to remember," he said. "Now, I think I want to come here to begin." She stepped closer, her gloved hands slipping into his. "Then let's begin," she whispered. Below them the valley stretched wide, endless and quiet. A world waiting not to be conquered, but simply loved. That night, as they tucked Lily into bed, she asked sleepily, "Is Miss Margaret going to stay forever?" Tom looked at Margaret, who was already smiling. "I hope so," he said. Lily grinned, eyes drifting closed. "Good, because I like her pancakes better." Margaret gasped. "Excuse me?" Tom laughed, really laughed, the kind of laugh that carried no sorrow in its shadow. It was the sound of something whole. The spring came early that year, not with fanfare, not all at once, but gently, like someone knocking on the door of a house they already knew the way into. The icicles melted from the eaves, the earth softened underfoot, and the sky turned a clearer shade of blue than Tom had remembered in years. He stood outside the cabin now, hammer in hand, sweat on his brow, the sound of wood meeting nail echoing softly through the valley. Behind him, a large wooden sign leaned against the porch wall, still waiting to be hung. The Benc workshop. Learn, build, belong. It wasn't a business, not in the traditional sense. There would be no stockholders, no investors, no launch, parties. Just a wide workbench, a few old tools, and a growing number of neighbors, young and old, who came to learn how to fix more than just machines. Teenagers from town, veterans, a retired teacher. Even a young widow who'd never used a drill in her life, and Tom, still the same man with calloused hands and quiet eyes, but no longer hiding. Inside, Lily was helping Margaret sort through donated books for the new community corner they were building near the wood stove. She had declared herself head of story time, a title she'd insisted required great seriousness and glitter markers. Margaret watched the little girl move with purpose and joy, then looked out the window at the man she loved, standing in the sunlight, sleeves rolled, smile easy. She remembered the first time she saw him. Cold, guarded, surrounded by walls made of wood and grief. But now, he had begun again, and somehow, so had she. That afternoon, the townspeople gathered in the clearing behind the house for what Tom insisted was not an official opening. There were folding chairs, homemade cookies, thermoses of strong coffee, and one child who kept stealing all the napkins for reasons unknown. Margaret stood beside Tom as he stepped onto the makeshift porch and looked out at the faces before him. Some familiar, some not, but all willing to be part of something small and meaningful. He cleared his throat, hands in his pockets. "I don't have much to say," he began, voice even. "But for most of my life I thought you had to be big to matter, make noise, be seen, leave your name on buildings." He paused, eyes scanning the crowd. "Turns out, you don't. Sometimes all you need is a place where people feel welcome. A safe place to start over, to rebuild, not just engines, but trust, self-worth, community." Margaret felt her chest tighten, her hand instinctively reaching for his. Tom's voice softened. "This place isn't about what I used to do. It's about who we still can become." A moment of silence. Then someone clapped, and then someone else, and then the whole clearing was filled with the kind of applause that didn't roar, but warmed, like firelight. That evening, after the crowd had left and the sun dipped below the ridge, Tom walked with Margaret and Lily up the hill one more time. The bench was still there. So were the memories, but they no longer carried the weight of loss. They felt lighter now, transformed by the quiet presence of what came after. As they sat together, Lily leaned against Margaret's side, thumb tucked under her chin. "Daddy," she said, "are we a real family now?" Tom turned to her, heart full. "We've always been real," he said, "but now we're complete." They stayed on the hill until the stars came out, scattered like secrets across the night. Margaret tilted her head back, watching the sky. "It's funny," she murmured. "What is?" Tom asked. "How something can fall apart so completely and still be made into something beautiful." Tom looked at her, eyes filled with the kind of truth only time could carve. "Sometimes," he said, "it has to fall apart so we can choose how to put it back together." Margaret smiled. "Then I choose this." She reached for his hand, he took it, and neither of them let go. In the months that followed, the workshop became more than a building. It became a heartbeat. A widower who hadn't spoken in years started showing up to help build birdhouses. A teenager with a history of fights learned to carve wood. Lily started teaching kids how to read under the tree by the creek. Margaret began offering writing classes on Sunday afternoons, her words no longer hidden. And Tom, he was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was a father, a partner, a builder of broken things. But most of all, he was a man who chose to love again, with everything he had left. On the wall above the fireplace, the Falcon jet key now hung in a small glass case. Not as a trophy, not as a secret, but as a reminder that the past doesn't have to define the future, and that even a man who lost everything can still build something that matters. Now that you've heard the story, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you? Listening from? What part of the story touched your heart the most? Let me know in the comments. I read every one, and it truly means the world to connect with you. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel for more heartfelt, healing stories like this one. We're building a small but beautiful community here, and you are so welcome to be a part of it. Thank you truly for spending your time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.